All right, hey everyone. Again, my name is Jeff Walker. I'm an instructor in the Graduate School's Professional Development Program. Today's topic is going to be tips for academic writing. What I do kind of full time for the graduate school is I teach communication and writing courses. So I teach some actual courses related to academic writing. I'm the director of the Research Communication Certificate Program. So that's a 12 credit hour program that students, graduate students and postdocs from across campus can earn from taking classes related to writing, communicating about your research to different types of audiences, to the public, to the media, to policymakers, grant writing, that sort of thing. So if any of y'all have any questions about other classes that we teach or programs that the graduate school offers, then I'm happy to talk to you after today's lecture on that kind of stuff too. A couple of other things that I help out with, just to make a couple of quick plugs. Y'all might have heard of or gone to the 3MT competition that we just had. So I help out with that, the 3-minute thesis competition. We also do something called Discoveries in the Making. Have any of you heard of that before? Or a couple of you have? So this is also open to all graduate students and postdocs. It's where you present your research at Ghost Train Brewery, actually. So the idea is you're presenting your research to the general public while people are just, having a beer. So that's something else that I help out with. And so if you want any more information on that kind of stuff, we are recruiting speakers for the spring and summer. I've got some handouts, and I will provide these to folks online. I'll make sure to get this to y'all by email. But if you just take one, and that's it. Thank you. So I like to start out writing sessions, especially starting at 8 a.m. by trying to get our brains working a little bit with a little free writing. So you can write on this handout or on your own paper, but I just want you to take 3 or 4 minutes and free write on this topic, because I want to make sure that we're able to kind of address some of our concerns in the hour that we've got together, and just see where we are and what we currently think about academic writing. So if y'all would, just brainstorm and free write on this. What are your top 3 to 4 concerns about writing? Okay, let's go ahead and share a little bit. So just share with a partner or two who's near you for right now. Talk about what some of the big things that you were thinking about are. So what are your big concerns about writing? Hi, how are you? Sure. All right. So hopefully y'all have found that you may share some concerns, or you may now have brand new concerns that you hadn't thought about before. What are some of the big things that y'all talked about? Anyone want to share a concern with the group?
Missing key literature or key references in your statement.
Yeah, so missing something important, especially if you're kind of starting in a kind of new area to you. And then there's the question of, when do you know enough? When have you gotten familiar enough to start writing about it? Yeah, that we can try to address that kind of question today. Cool. Other concerns?
Logic issue.
Larger issue? Logic.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
I mean, just some people just talk about the issue A, then did not explain clearly, jump to the issue B.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so making sure you're logically and thoroughly explaining something, then transitioning to the next point. Okay, good. Other concerns? Inconcise, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of the opposite concern of what we would have had a long time ago as undergrads, of trying to fill up whatever the page limit is. Trying to be concise.
Editing while writing.
Editing while writing. Yeah, this is interesting. We'll talk about that, so I want to hold on to that. Editing while writing versus writing first and then editing later are two different approaches.
The other piece is the tense. Because I review a manuscript, some people that use past tense, some people use present tense to explain their results.
Okay.
Which is better. The other thing is then people always use the first, like I did
Right.
this, I did that, so or we.
Yeah. So a couple of things here. Number one is which tense to use at which point in the paper, and then whether to use first person voice or not. So using I or we or versus this paper did this or this study looked at, right? A lot of that is going to be dependent on what journal you're aiming for. Some journals might be more likely to use first-person voice or not, and I think that's one good step is kind of looking at, like I always say, to quote Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. So know what journal you want to be published in really early on in the writing process so that you can kind of get familiar with articles in that journal and see what's the standard for them, like how are those papers written so you can kind of write in the same style.
Another concern is a single citation. For example, the literary review, every sentence just like one paper. So this is, I think, is an issue.
Okay.
The other thing is I reviewed the paper yesterday, so that the conclusion is not supported by their own paper. It's exactly the influence of their spending.
Okay, exaggerating the importance or the results. Okay. So these are good concerns for if you see that in other writing, you want to make sure you're not doing that in your own. That makes sense. Yeah. Good. So what are some other thoughts, other concerns?
Time it will take to actually do the work.
Yeah.
And getting it and then accept.
Yes. Yeah. So doing the work and then sometimes the waiting game and just maybe holding yourself accountable and being on your own timeline for writing while also working with other timelines, whether that's other people giving you feedback or on the journal and waiting on decisions, that sort of thing. So we won't be able to address every single thing within the hour that we've got together. But I've kind of organized this workshop into a list of 5 things that we do have time to talk about. So let's get started with some of those. And the first is related to timelines. It's related to the process of getting started, and that is to create SMART goals for yourself. How many of you have heard that acronym used? I mean, it's a pretty common acronym for setting goals in general, so you can apply this elsewhere in your life if you want to, but it's definitely helpful for writing. So to create SMART goals. SMART, we're using as an acronym here to mean specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So you want your goals to be as specific as possible. So something else I do is I lead dissertation writing workshops. And I say, you know, y'all have gone through that at this point. You can't just say, okay, today I'm going to sit down and write my dissertation, work on my dissertation. You need to be a little more specific than that. Maybe you say, I'm going to write, I'm going to work on the introduction to this chapter, or I'm going to work on the results section of this, right? You really want to be as specific as possible with what you're trying to achieve. You also want your goals to be measurable. So how do you say, okay, I was successful in working on my dissertation today? Is that because I wrote a sentence? Is that because I wrote 10 pages? Unlikely. but you want your results to be measurable, or how successful you are at meeting your goals. So maybe that is, I want to write 3 paragraphs, and I can measure that at the end of that session. I can say, well, I only wrote 2 paragraphs, but I got this far. Or a word count, or you could do that with time and say, I'm going to write for 2 hours today. But that's the idea, is you want to be able to measure how successful you are in completing your goal. Just as important, but often overlooked, is you want your goal to be achievable and realistic. So it's great to have high expectations, high goals for yourself, but they shouldn't be too far up to be unattainable. Because what happens when we're writing, how many of you have ever felt guilt while you were writing? Or maybe it's guilt when you're not writing. Yeah. Right, we feel guilty because we know it's like, I should be writing right now, but I really want to sleep, or I really want to do something, anything else but writing. For me, it's whenever I know I need to write and I sit down to write, it's like I have a sudden urge to clean my house. And I never, that never occurs to me any other time. But this is common, is we feel guilt about not writing or about not writing enough. A lot of that is tied to us not setting achievable goals for ourselves. So you want to be, set those goals that, yes, they're goals you need to meet in order to finish this project, but don't be too unrealistic. What else is important is that what's realistic for your neighbor may not be realistic for you. What's realistic for you may not be realistic for someone else in this room. You have to figure it out for yourself. I know for me, it's not realistic at all for me to say, okay, I'm going to write for 2 hours every day. My PhD advisor somehow did that. And I don't know how that happened, but I don't have that time. So you want to figure out, okay, what's a realistic writing schedule for you? We're going to be talking about what some writing experts say are the best practices, but I could talk about the best practices all day. The best practice for you is whatever works for you. And so I'm going to give you a lot of advice, but the key is to figure out what piece of advice works for you and to stick with that. And last, you want your goals to be timely, so you want them to be time-bound, in that you set benchmarks for yourself, you set a timeline for yourself, and the next page in our handout is kind of related to that. Did everyone get a copy of this? Sorry. The next page is related to that. It's about setting smart goals, smart timelines. So what I like to do is kind of set the final deadline and then work backwards. So if I know I want to have an article submitted to a journal by May, then what do I need to accomplish by a couple of weeks before then, right? So you work your way backwards so that you can then set more specific benchmarks for yourself along the way. And you know whether you're making the progress that you need to make or not. Along with that, though, you still want to be realistic, and life happens, and you want to leave a little bit of flexibility in that timeline so that if you're not meeting a couple of those deadlines, you don't start to have that really bad guilt. You don't start to feel bad about yourself and about your writing, and you can adjust as you need to. So you need to build in a little bit of flexibility in there. So I would like y'all to, with a partner or two, take some of these goals and make them into smarter goals. So more specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely. Just pick a couple of these and talk about them, try to reword them together, and then we'll share a little bit. Okay?
I like number 5, that's great. All right, so this week I will work with teachers. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that really yeah.
Hi, Jim Parker. Yeah, great. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. No, I understand. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good. Would you like me to email you a copy of this to send to people online? I'll do that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just send me an email. No problem. It's nice to meet you.
I don't write it down.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and share a couple of these. So who wants to pick one out and tell us what you came up with?
All right, so for number 5, we said today we will identify 10 sources for the introduction of our dissertation.
All right, good. Yeah. So that's more specific. That's more measurable, right? You have a number that you're aiming for. Achievable, realistic, maybe. Yeah.
We don't know. We don't write dissertations.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's realistic. And it is time bound by being today. So good. Very smart. One more. Let's do one more. Anyone want to share?
For number 1, for example, you could say this week I will work on the introduction and methods at the end of my research paper. So just make like a measurable
Yes.
type of, or a quantifiable amount that you're going to put on instead of saying it generally.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. So this transitions into the next thing that I want to talk about. Here we go. Keep losing the clicker. My second tip is to make writing a habit, and it's related to finding these writing practices that work for you. What happens to me, even if I keep it at that, that's a more specific goal that you said, but if I say this week I want to do this, what'll happen is, it's Friday, it's still this week, and have I gotten any writing done? This is what happens, is we can keep putting it off unless I'm really specific about when I'm going to accomplish things. So make writing a habit really deals with this, is trying to get us out of the habit of putting writing off and then binge writing, kind of just writing a bunch all at once and then getting exhausted with that and having several days off again before we get back to that paper. So let me give you one piece of advice that a lot of writing experts say, and I want to get y'all's feedback on this. They say that you should write for 15 minutes every day. Have y'all heard that before? Some of you have. So write for 15 minutes every day. What do y'all think of that advice?
Not work for me.
No. Why not?
Because when I sit there for 15 minutes, I have to open my file folder. I think about what's my last time what I did yesterday.
Oh yeah. So it's like I could sit there staring at a blank screen for 15 minutes trying to think of one word to write. Yeah, so that getting started hurdle is definitely one thing that comes to mind with this advice. What else do y'all think about this? 15 minutes a day. What? Yeah.
Actually, it's kind of intriguing because, you know, like you said, there are days and days where you don't do any writing. If you could at least do 15 minutes and at least sit down and, you know, think for a few minutes, and then at least for me, you know, it may turn into 30 minutes, you know, and it may actually be something that's substantive.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, so I think that's a key part of the advice is it's not just saying 15 minutes and don't write anymore for that day. So those more productive writing sessions are likely to be when that 15 minutes turns into 30 or 45 minutes. But I think that's the other thing that you're saying is that 15 minutes that you may not have sat down and even thought about your paper that day, unless you set that aside. So I definitely see kind of the pros and cons here. They're saying this because it's a realistic goal, hopefully, for all of us. I mentioned earlier, it's not realistic for me to say I'm going to sit down for 2 hours today and write. Sometimes it's not realistic for me to say I'm going to sit down for an hour today and write. But the idea is you can find 15 minutes somewhere, hopefully. If not, we have bigger problems that we need to try to work out. But that's the idea. So you can find those 15 minutes somewhere. Some days that 15 minutes may not be like all that productive. But then other days that 15 minutes will be productive, or it'll turn into more productive, longer writing sessions. And at the very least, you've thought about your paper. And so I think that's the other thing is that it should help you get over that hurdle of getting started. Because sometimes what happens for me, if I have a week in between writing sessions, is I'll forget what I was thinking about. I'll forget kind of where I was and have to, you know, take a little bit of time to remember. Whereas if you're doing it every day, it's on your mind. And actually, even when you're not in that 15 minutes, like it could still pop up in your mind later in that day, just because you sat down to give it some thought. So that's one strategy that works for some people. But and I encourage you to try it out if you haven't before, just to see if it works for you. But there's other writing strategies, and I'm interested in strategies that have worked for you or haven't worked for you in the past, or any tips or tricks that you have for writing, just in terms of being productive. Do y'all have any tricks, tips, strategies that you want to share with the group? Mm-hmm.
So I was once told a tip that I like, that whenever you pause writing, so instead of like pausing at the end of a paragraph, to actually pause in the middle of a sentence or the middle of a paragraph, because then when you go back into it, you kind of have already started that train of thought. Mm-hmm. You're not having to kind of restart that, okay, here's a new paragraph. How do I want to start this? So it's kind of easier to get back into it. Yeah,
I like that a lot. Related to that, I've heard like go ahead and write the first sentence of the next paragraph, like so you don't have to start from scratch. That's great. Mm-hmm.
So I tried that and I struggled a lot with that. No, should I start with this part? So for me, I couldn't do that, but what I did try to do instead is I make myself 2 or 3 little notes about something concrete I can start with the next time. So, you know, I need to find an article on this, or so that next time I have some hook to get me started on the next thing. So same concept, but I can put in the sentence.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Cool. Mm-hmm.
setting a timer. So like setting up like a 45-minute or 25-minute timer so that I can get up and like fidget and do whatever, like, and then get back to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I do that. I do that with writing, and then if I like I said, I feel the urge to clean, I'll set like a 5-minute timer for me to do that, and then it's time to write. You know, so I time my breaks and my writing.
What would be the utility of setting a timer like for the writing part? Like, you know what I mean? Like, let's say the timer goes off for 30 minutes, but you're still like in a good flow.
What do y'all think?
For me, it's less about the ending part and it's more about if I know I only have 30 minutes
Yeah.
and I have an urge to check email, I'm like, well, I'm burning some of that 30 minutes on the email, so I better focus for the 30 minutes and then I can do the email.
Yeah.
So it's more about utilizing that time than making myself stop,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
I think that's right. Other tricks, strategies?
I just did right. I read Saturday in my office, not at home.
Oh yeah. How many of you have a writing space that works best for you? And that could be your office, it could be a home office, it could be a kitchen table, it could be a coffee shop, a library. And then there's probably places where you can't get any writing. Like I don't know how people write in a library or a coffee shop because there's too many distractions there for me. But for other people, it's completely different. So finding the writing space that works for you. How many of you are morning writers? How many of you are evening, late night writers? And then some in between there, I guess. Why does a certain time work best for y'all? So a lot of writing experts will say the morning hours are the best. Why do you think that is?
When I've gotten a chance to be distracted by everything else of the day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the thing is I can wake up and plan to write that day, but if I put it off until the afternoon, what's going to happen is other things are going to pop up on my schedule, and just the way that my brain works, I'll prioritize those things over writing, and so that writing may or may not get done. So that's one of the things is that if you can write before you check your emails, before you do anything else, then you've gotten it out of the way, you've been productive already and feel good about what you've done. I've said that, I'm not a morning writer because I can't make myself get up at whatever, 5 or 6 to start writing if I have the choice of sleeping in instead. Yeah.
I heard a great quote that to actually write something, you have to wander around the house, read the cereal box, reorganize a drawer until you can absolutely run out of any other thing that you can do until you have to sit down and write.
Yeah. There's something to that, I think. I think a lot of people go through that kind of experience. Yeah.
The other trick I think that I've found useful, y'all are going to get famous, said it last week in the country as well, is to find an accountability partner. So somebody that you tie something to. So it could be a friend where you say we're both going to do the introduction, or it could be a co-author where you say I'm going to send this to you by whatever date. Mm-hmm. But setting some kind of accountability around what your SMART goal is, so that you're not the only one holding yourself to that.
Absolutely. Too often we make writing into like a solo process where we don't like other people to see what we're writing until we absolutely have to send it off.
There are web programs now too for that, where you log on as you start your writing and it tracks how much you write throughout the week.
Yeah.
There are like accountability things.
That's great. That's great, and whether it's having a formal writing group or just having a friend or two who's kind of going through the same process and is willing to look at what you're doing and you are willing to hold each other accountable and say, okay, what writing did you get done this week? That's all very useful, and it can be useful for some of the other concerns that we had at the beginning. Making sure that you're not missing a major piece of literature in in your paper. Probably your peer can help, if they're also kind of in the field, they may be able to help look at your paper and see about that kind of stuff. Any other tips or strategies before we move on? A couple of other things that have worked for me in the past. When I was working on my dissertation, my philosophy was I didn't do the 15 minutes a day thing. I did. I could have one day off, but I could never have 2 days off from writing. And so that way I was at least writing every other day. And more often than that, I was writing 2 or 3 days in a row, have a day off. And on that day off, I know I've got to write tomorrow. And that worked pretty well for me. Okay. So the third piece of advice I have is to model good writing. And page 3 is related to that. We're not going to go through an exercise related to this today for time purposes, but I've given you all this handout, which are some different things that you can look at when you're modeling good writing. So Wendy Laura Belcher has written a great book, and I teach a class that's based on this book. It's called Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks. She says it's a common misconception that great writers are uniquely talented. They're more often prolific readers who have intuited many of the principles of writing for their field by reading widely in it. A model does not have to be similar in content, rather it should provide a sound structure and solutions to some of your writing dilemmas. So try to find an article that approaches the material in the way that you hope to. When I talk to dissertation writers, I ask them, how many of you have read a dissertation before? And very few hands go up because, we don't just go out and read dissertations typically. But I say, okay, but you're writing a dissertation. You've not read any before. So step 1 is to get familiar with that genre. Look at some dissertations. It's the same thing for anything that we're writing. And I think is especially useful if we're writing a journal article and we know a couple of journals that we might want that article published in. So that step would be to look at those journals and see what articles in those journals look like. Then we can kind of analyze those. So you can analyze those based on some of these things. There's higher order concerns and lower order concerns written down on the handout. Higher order concerns would be things like the purpose, the thesis of the paper, the audience, who is the paper written for. You can tell by the language it uses, by how formal, informal the language is, that sort of thing. Organization, how long is the article? How is it structured? Are there different headers, subheadings? And then lower order concerns, which are related to all of these things. The sentences, the flow of the paper, word choice, and presentation, meaning formatting, meaning what citation style is it using, that sort of thing. So these are some things that you can kind of use as you're analyzing a potential model article. Something else that might be helpful is to kind of do a reverse outline of that article so that you can compare it to how you're planning to organize your paper. But I think this is important is you find several models so that you can, because you might like the introduction to one model article, but you like the results section from another. And it's not that you are copying those papers. That's not what I'm suggesting. You're just using them as a model for kind of how they're written, how they're organized, whatever elements you think are positive about those pieces. And again, it's very important when we're trying to get published in one journal or another that we're familiar with the standards of that journal and what a good paper that's been published in that journal looks like. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to mention is practice ethical writing. This didn't really come up in the concerns that y'all shared at the beginning, so I'm not sure that we're gonna do this activity in class, but y'all will have it to take home with you. But a couple of things before we get to what's in the handout. There's different ideas for why we include citations in papers, and it kind of starts with this generally used kind of, if we're teaching an undergraduate class and we're talking about plagiarism and why people include citations, this is kind of the idea that we come up with. Citations are used to recognize and acknowledge the intellectual property rights of authors. They're a matter of ethics, a defense against plagiarism, right? We include a source so that we're not plagiarizing. But there's other contributions that I think are helpful in understanding why they're useful. Citations are reading guides. They point the reader to the relevant works. I think that's why they're most helpful to me in most cases when I'm reading an article, is I can see, okay, what else that article cites, so that I can then start getting more and more familiar with that body of literature. And last is really important for us as writers. Citations are used to create a research space for the citing author. By describing what's been done, citations also point the way to what has not been done. And so, this is blocked off, but prepare a space for new research. Citations allow us to say, okay, here's what's been done, and here's the gap in that literature. Here's how my paper is going to fill in that gap. So we use citations to create a space for our new research, our new contribution to that literature. So what's on the handout that y'all can kind of take home and read through and actually kind of do an activity with if you want to, if you think it would be helpful for you, is this ethical summary protocol. This is based on a couple of ideas. One is that accidental plagiarism is a thing, and this is a way to make sure we're not accidentally plagiarizing sources that we're reading. Number two is that this is potentially a more efficient way of taking notes and paraphrasing, summarizing what you've read. I have often considered myself a slow writer, if we can kind of go back to one of the things that we began today with, one of the concerns that someone had. One of the reasons that I used to be a slow writer is because I didn't separate the writing and editing processes out from each other. It's like I could sit there and work on the same, couple of sentences for, I don't know, it just felt like an eternity, and still not be happy with the word choice exactly. I don't know if any of y'all can relate to that. And that's not the most efficient way to go about your writing. What I found, and kind of why we start with a free write at the very beginning of this workshop, is free writing is where you're supposed to just write without editing yourself, without censoring yourself. Just write whatever is kind of coming to mind. Sometimes that can be useful to get started in writing, but a lot of those principles can be useful whenever we're writing something. Is to just write without being a perfectionist. Write without editing yourself too much. Because here's the thing, no matter how long you spend on those couple of sentences, whether you spend 1 minute or whether you spend an hour, you're still going to have to go back and edit the whole document again. And are you going to be happy with them even if you spend an hour with them? I don't know. So it's not the most efficient way to go about your writing. What is better for a lot of people is to write first, edit later. So spend time writing, knowing that you're going to go back and fix things that you're not happy with. Yeah.
I have a question with the ethical writing. So,
Yeah.
you know, for biomedical research, a lot, particularly the methods section, tends to be fairly, like the structure is very formulaic. So how do you, I mean, where's that line? Because, you know, there's only so many ways to say we use proportional hazards models to calculate, you know, hazard ratios and 95% confidence intervals, right? So like, you know, a lot of that is just kind of boilerplate. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so this is a good point. I'm curious for other people that are in that area to chime in with any advice that you've heard about what would be plagiarism or not in that kind of situation. Do you have any ideas?
I have the same concern because I use the same research method to write the different papers in a different area, but the methods are same. So just I read many times, but I just hard for me to try to use a different language.
Yeah. So this is a common concern in people. Okay. I'm curious to get other feedback before
I feel like I exit the idea of plagiarism in the method section because it is so like, right, it's like you're not going to give instructions on how to write, you know, put together a bike in different ways. Like it's just, unless it's something, I mean, if it's a plan that's citable, right, the methods are citable, but I don't worry about, or maybe I should, I don't know. It just feels like it's not really a creative thought or something that I feel like I have to cite. It's more like, there's only so many ways to say it.
That's what we did.
Yeah, I don't know.
Even when you're, you know, so many papers use the same data from the same studies. So I mean, I think as long as you cite kind of what has generally been done, there are usually references for different, you know, ways that the studies were structured, and you just kind of, but it's generally the same language you see in all the papers. Yeah.
So these are good points. Is there's a lot of there are very common sentence stems, sentence structures that are used in these parts of the paper quite commonly, and it's not typically, it wouldn't be considered plagiarism to I mean, if there's not other ways of saying that kind of thing. Yeah. Well, let's look at this. We won't work through it for time purposes, but I went backwards. But let's kind of look at these steps because this would help you potentially in the sections of your paper where this does really matter. So step one is to read and analyze the original text. You do that for the 5 W's plus. Who or the authors did what, when, where, and why. Then 3 more questions. How, so what's the significance? And then what next? What are the implications? So in step 1 of this, let's just say that we're kind of reading one article and paraphrasing what that article said. That's what you do. Now, on the surface, this may appear to be a more time-consuming method, and this was the next point that I was getting to, is I've often considered myself a slow reader as well as a slow writer. And that's because I can read something, I've read 2 pages of it, and then all of a sudden I realize I have no idea what I just read. I just, zoned out somehow. This is a more intentional way of reading, where you're looking for what you know are the most important elements as you read. So in step 1, you're looking for those elements and you're just highlighting, underlining. You're not making a ton of notes yet. Step 2 would be to take notes in your own words. Again, you focus on those elements of the 5 W's plus. And if you're going to use the source's language, go ahead and put it in quotation marks from the very beginning so that you're not going to get confused later on. So we usually go from steps 1 and 2 to the paraphrasing part, where we're trying to write what the source said. And that's where a lot of times we get stuck and we can't think of better ways to say what they've already said, or different ways to say what they've already said. So step 3 is important, and that's to draft from memory or from your notes only. You hide the original text. You don't look at while you write, because that'll give yourself a chance to think and to come up with some of your own words. You draft your summary, from your memory or from your notes, again, in your own words. So if you feel comfortable being able to do it from your memory, then that's great. But if you need your notes, then that's fine. But the key is just to hide the original text. Step 4 would be to review your summary with the author's text and then correct and revise as necessary. You perform this RAP test. Is your summary relevant? Is it accurate? And is it appropriately paraphrased, summarized in your own words and not in the sources? And then step 5 would be to go back and cite. Now, on things like kind of common sentence stems or sections of papers that you've noticed in a journal, it's like, this is not worded much differently from this. What section of the paper did y'all say that's? Methods, yeah. You know, if you're seeing that across articles in your journals, then, you know, you're probably okay. But what's important, though, is in sections where you're talking about research that's, you know, in a lit review, for example, you don't want to be using that source's exact words unless you are using quotations and citing it that way. But otherwise, this is really important and where I think this can come in handy. So in your own time, if you want to get some practice with that, you can on the next page where there's just a little paragraph that you can practice with. Sometimes it can be helpful to kind of practice this method with shorter chunks of the paper first before you start doing this with fuller articles. But again, although this is a more systematic way, I mean, that's the point, is this is a more systematic way of taking notes and then paraphrasing. And therefore, it's going to take a little bit longer, especially at first when you're first starting to use this. In the end, this can save you some time, though, I think is one benefit of this, once you kind of get used to doing this. Okay, we're going to wrap up with the fifth and final tip that I have for you all, and that's to create outlines. So I'm a big outline person. I like to outline everything about an article before I start writing it. I'm not sure how y'all are, but sometimes actually, well, I'm a big outlines. I love outlines and I love lists, as you can see from me making a list of 5 things. Sometimes that can be to the detriment of my writing. Is like I'm making a checklist and I spend longer writing the checklist than I do actually working on my paper. But outlines can be a good thing because they allow you to kind of, you don't have to, when you're actually writing, you don't have to start at the introduction. If you have an outline and you know you're gonna, this part of the paper is gonna fall here, and that's what you're more interested in writing at the moment, you can jump to that part, right? So you don't have to write from beginning to end. Outlines are good. There's different kinds of outlines, and when I send this handout electronically, I'll also include some other information with some other commonly used writing structures that are helpful when you're outlining as well. The one that I included in this paper is an outline for an abstract, because I don't think we always, I don't know, abstracts are often an afterthought. It's pretty common for it to be the last thing that you write. And that can be a challenge, actually, is waiting until the last minute to write an abstract and then trying to make your ideas concise enough to fit into that abstract. An abstract, just like an outline, can be a good pre-writing activity. And a common way of outlining an abstract is this Ojish model. And you can see the steps here. O, outline a problem in the field. And this actually answers that tense question that we talked about earlier. What's in present tense? What's in past tense? J, justify the question with a gap in the literature. I is introduce the study purpose. S is summarize the study method. And then H is highlight the findings and implications. So no matter what the length of your abstract is, across disciplines and across different lengths of abstracts, you'll see that this model, or a slight variation of it, is followed pretty commonly. And on the next page are a couple of examples that follow the OGISH model abstract. So whether you write your abstract at the beginning or the end of your project, this can be a good model, rather than what I used to do, which drove me crazy, is I would start copying and pasting parts of my introduction, and then all of a sudden it's, you know, a giant thing. So actually following this model, rather than doing that, copying and pasting parts of your paper, trying to do it that way, will make more sense for you. But doing this as a pre-writing activity can also give you a good idea of how well you understand your content area before you really dig in and start writing. Now, obviously, if you write your abstract first, some of this could very well change by the end of your writing project. But again, it can be useful, I think, as a pre-writing activity. So this kind of wraps up what I wanted to cover today. Do y'all have any questions about things that we've talked about, or anything else related to writing that you want to talk about? I know we're about out of time.
I have a question about your course. So, you said it, can you just describe your course again?
Okay, so I have, so that one is GRD 729, and I think I'm going to be teaching it this summer. It's a 12-week course, and it's based on this book by Wendy Laura Belcher. So the idea is that you're working on a journal article or something for publication.
The end of the paper?
Yes, that's it. So I will say, you know, it's not a miracle course in that you can start completely from scratch and then have a finished paper in 12 weeks. So it's good to have either a draft or something that you've been working on a little bit. Yeah, exactly.
So what time?
I don't know the time of that course yet, but yeah. Some other courses that we offer are GRD 708, which is a 1 credit hour course that's going to be this spring, and it's just a 1 Saturday in the semester, where we'll talk about some things that are similar in nature to what we've spent this morning on. We've got GRD 727, which is another writing course that's taught online as well.
Can I ask Emily a question? So graduate school courses, do they count towards MPH? That fall over into that world?
We used to require 727 for the MPH. I don't think we do anymore.
Can it count as an elective?
We probably can count as an elective. Yeah, but we did experiment. And I think for a while, the writing group from the grad school was actually teaching in the school.
What's your opinion about, you know, say you have a paper, you're having trouble starting with the abstract is the first thing you write.
Yeah, I think that can be really useful, because you can kind of tell, because in this model for an abstract, it's kind of forcing you to think about what's the gap in the literature that you're trying to fill in, what the purpose of your article is, and whether or not you're able to answer those questions can be helpful in saying, okay, am I ready to really start writing this in earnest, or do I need to do some more research first and keep working on this idea? Yeah, I think it can be helpful. Yeah.
Sometimes we submit an abstract to a conference, so that was accepted and present. After that, we send this abstract to a paper. What's the better way to do that?
Well, so I think that writing the abstract first can be helpful. And so I don't really disagree with that approach, if that's what you're asking. Yeah, I mean, I think that can make sense, is to write the abstract first and expand that into a paper.
Just one other comment is that for a lot of you, there's actually sort of outlines already out there. So there's consort guidelines for clinical trials and stroke guidelines for observational studies that, you know, they're not specific, but it's like, okay, your introduction should have these components.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's what's helpful about modeling other writing too, is that you can kind of deconstruct an outline from that and use that kind of as a model for yourself. Yeah. Well, if you come up with other questions, I'm happy to answer you. My email is jeffwalk@uab.edu. And, you know, anything about writing, I may have a resource. I mean, I have a bunch of resources that I didn't give you all today. So, you know, reach out to me. I'll be honest whether I know the answer or not, and whether I have something that might be helpful for you or not. Okay? Thank you, guys.